Hi, and welcome back to the HE Enabled podcast. I'm Kath, and this week I am joined by Dr. Matt Williams. Matt is a lecturer in politics at the University of Oxford, and for the past 8 years he's also been the Access and Career Development Fellow at Jesus College. I met Matt during my time at Oxford, and we've worked together on some outreach content in the past. It is an absolute pleasure to have him on the show today, and I can't wait to get started with this interview. So, Matt, please can you introduce yourself and share a little about your background in higher education?
Sure. Hi, Kath. Thank you so much for having me on. So, my name's Matt, and as you say, I teach politics at Oxford, and I have done for about 15 years. I started my higher education at Bristol University an appallingly long time ago, back in 2001. Then I came to Oxford to do my master's and my doctorate, and I did a bit of teaching for a bunch of colleges. And now, yeah, I'm the Access Fellow at Jesus College, which is lovely.
Yeah, and then we worked together. I did the how the grades aren't everything video
Yes.
back in
Yeah,
2023, which
that
is
was
really
fun.
nice. So yeah, we had a good time working together before. So, if you are comfortable saying, how did
Mm.
your disability impact your experience of being a student in higher education?
Yeah, so I have a very rare eyesight condition. It's a form of macular dystrophy. And by very rare, we went to the specialist, me and my mum, who has the same thing. We went to the specialist eye hospital in London called Moorfields, and they reckon that we were the only related pair in Europe to have this condition. The only other pair related in the world were in Japan. It's an incredibly rare thing. And um, as a consequence, it caused both my mum and me quite a lot of trouble actually in school, not so much at university, because it was very difficult to explain to people what the problem is. Glasses don't make any difference to the eyesight. We're practically sort of half blind, if you like, sort of literally both eyes work half as well as they ought to. And if you go into school and you say, I can't see anything on the board, I can't read any of the notes, I'm really struggling here, and yet you're not wearing glasses, the teachers just think you're having a laugh, basically. So I had a really tough time at school, especially in things like sports where you'd need hand-eye coordination, and with some teachers who just didn't weren't in any way curious about what any of the implications were. At undergraduate level at Bristol, that was also a bit of a struggle, but I think partly just because I was a bit of a I don't know. I don't know whether it was the culture or whether it was me. I was being quite stiff upper lippish about it, and I sort of said, "Right, I'm not going to have any special adjustments. I'm just going to like white knuckle through this and get it all done myself." So I didn't have any extra time for exams or any sort of special arrangements, even though I really struggled to see the exam papers and read the books and things like that. By the time I got to Oxford, I was a bit more open to just seeing what support was available, but basically just got exams in my own special dark room because I see better in the dark. But that was about it. So I didn't, I don't know, speak up as much as I would now advise my students to do so. And at times it was definitely difficult because given how much you're expected to read at uni, that was really hard. So yeah, I think I found it difficult, but at the time I didn't necessarily acknowledge it. I just sort of tried to pretend like it wasn't a problem.
Yeah, it's kind of that stubbornness where you kind of don't want to ask for help. I've been there obviously in a different context, but yeah,
Mm,
no, that's fair enough. So obviously now you do outreach and you do lecturing.
mm.
Did these experiences like kind of influence your career decisions when you were steering towards that way?
It's a really interesting question. I think it did, but I didn't realize it at the time, if that makes sense. So working in access and outreach, for example, is trying to encourage people who are underrepresented at universities to get in. From an from an economic perspective, I'm quite privileged. So in that sense, supporting as I do people from poorer backgrounds to get into universities like Oxford, I think was partly because I recognized that well, I always felt insecure and like an imposter. I think my experiences at school, not being able to see much, made me quite nervous and anxious. I've had lifelong troubles with that. Just because everyone expects you to be able to see, and they have no idea that I can't see anything. I can't see their faces. I'll sort of blank them accidentally and stuff like that. So I've always been very nervy, and so have I guess empathized with people who felt left out or felt like imposters or felt somewhat discarded by big institutions as well. And so I think that's part of what made me so attracted to access work and to helping other people. Um, but yeah, in terms of the teaching side of things, of getting into academic lecturing. I don't know. I mean, I think I was just really lucky because given how much reading you need to do as an academic, I don't really know how I got away with it. I mean, nowadays it's a lot better, right? There's screen readers and there's all sorts of ways that dense reading material can be translated. It's still hard, don't get me wrong, but I think it's more accessible now for someone with my sort of issue. And also, people seem much more mindful of the difficulties at higher education, which I think is excellent. Um, but I don't think there's any particular connection between academic interests. I think I was just a nerd, basically. I just loved politics. So,
That is totally fair.
yeah.
Um, this might be a bit of a dud question then, but I'll ask it anyway. So what was the transition from being a student to a lecturer like? Did you encounter any challenges with that?
It was relatively smooth because I was kind of doing both at the same time. So I was doing my doctorate in Oxford, and whilst doing that, I started tutorial teaching and lecturing at Oxford, and then also at the University of Reading. So it was kind of a smooth transition. It wasn't like a stop start sort of situation. And the transition was quite smooth. I think Oxford is accommodating if you're a tutor because the classes are very small, so the tutorials are tiny with only a handful of students. Lectures are in big lecture theatres, but you can kind of run them how you like in Oxford. You can have slides on a screen, or you can just go without notes or whatever you like. So there's no particular expectations around how you manage that. And I know people with a variety of different disabilities can cope and navigate that as tutors. So that I found relatively easy. Um, at Reading University, interestingly, there were more sort of structures and expectations around filling out mark sheets for student essays and having templated lecture slides and things like that. And they were sometimes a little bit hard to put together, but it's still totally manageable. And there was lots of accommodation given for me to support that. So that was all fine.
Yeah, that's really interesting. As someone who wants to go into academia, it's good to know how universities might shape things in different
Mhm.
ways. Um, so now I want to just talk a little bit about obviously what you're doing kind of nowadays and more recently. So
Mhm.
with your disability, has that kind of informed how you adapt your teaching practices for your students?
I hope so. I mean, it would be terrible, wouldn't it, if I just have have had my own difficulties and then just deny my students any leeway. Um, so yes, I mean, it's but I suppose I'm still concerned that lots of students, as I did, are masking these days and pretending like nothing's wrong until suddenly everything is wrong, and they're suddenly not turning up to tutorials. So yes, I suppose I hope I make it very clear that accommodations can be made where where reasonable. Um, but I still get the sense, and indeed I sometimes see quite clearly that students are putting a brave face on it until they suddenly can't keep doing it anymore, which is sad, and I it's hard to sort of manage a student's expectations to the extent that they feel perfectly safe to just say, "Oh, thank goodness you mentioned that. Actually, yeah, I really could do with this help," and so on. So yeah, I think it's still quite a difficult thing to navigate.
Yeah, I think Oxford's a very proud place for a lot of very proud personalities.
Yeah,
And I think when you kind of balance that with the academic rigor, that can be a bit of a mixture for kind of bad things to be happening.
I think that's right. And
Um,
the intensity of the work as well is quite significant. And so sometimes people are really struggling, but as you say, they don't want to admit it.
yeah, or they might not know because you assume that kind of that struggle is very normalized,
Mm,
especially in
mm.
Oxford, unfortunately. So might be, oh, this kind of suffering is normal.
Yeah, right.
But hopefully that's something that's being dealt with society right now. I think it's getting a bit better, but still, you know, maybe we all need to be a bit more proactive in getting people to help themselves.
Sure.
But yeah, right, let's move on to access and outreach. So you've been incredibly proactive with access and outreach at Jesus, especially on the YouTube and the social media front. So how have you been able to leverage this platform to talk about disability, especially at kind of a very strict and proud university such as Oxford?
Well, thanks for that summary. I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm feeling quite modest about it, but it's kind. Yeah, I mean, we haven't said that much about disability. We've had, I think, two videos on it. And I've mentioned mental health, which not disability, of course, but is just sort of another sort of aspect. So probably not enough is the answer to your question, but there's such a huge demand for resources to help students work out what these universities want from them that we've struggled to do more stuff on disability. I suppose one thing I would say is that I do tend to point it out relatively frequently in my videos that I have an eyesight problem and just sort of say it in a way that I hope comes across as just it's just a normal thing. It's not a big deal. So I would like to do more stuff on disabilities because, you know, bottom line is we want to get the best students. And if people with disabilities who are the best of the best are feeling intimidated by universities like Oxford, then that's a real shame. And we'd be missing out on their what they have to offer and what they can bring to conversations we would be having otherwise. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And also like with the work you have been doing, because obviously I've been kind of keeping up with it as a Jesus student and alum. I think that a lot of it's kind of intersectional anyway, right? So a lot of the stuff that you're making is already very accessible, for example, because like maybe people with autism, you're preparing them through what an interview might look like. You do a lot of interviews on
Mm.
the YouTube channel, and you can kind of, even if it's not directly related to disability, it's still kind of approaching it in one way or another in the fact that it's demystifying the kind of processes in Oxford.
Oh, well, that's kind. I hope that is the effect it's having. Certainly, we would want to encourage more people with neurodiversity and disabilities to apply for sure.
Absolutely. So, a little bit more on the outreach work. What more do you think we can do to kind of promote applicants with disabilities, long term health conditions, and neurodiversities to come to university? If not Oxford, then maybe like universities across the sector.
Yeah, it's a really good question. Um, so which I'm gonna have to sort of slightly mull as I'm thinking out loud, but um, because we could think about the whole piece, right? I mean, because disability, long-term illness, neurodiversity, of course, that it covers like a huge chunk of the population potentially, and it would have such a variety of different manifestations. Uh, for example, if we just take physical mobility issues, that the estate in Oxford is not particularly accessible for people
No.
who say are wheelchair users.
Yeah.
So there's that sort of side of disability, and then there's things to do with sight or hearing, and then there's, as you say, long-term illness. I mean, I suppose we can and we are working to make the estate more sort of literally accessible, that people can navigate it, can get around without too many hazards. So I think that's the first and fairly sort of conspicuous change that the university is working towards. And all new buildings, as you would expect, are much more user friendly in that regard. They're not old sort of
Yeah.
medieval castles and whatnot. So that is a relatively sort of straightforward thing. I think more substantively, the university offering hasn't updated much in a long time. The 3-year degree, certainly at some universities, is taken as the correct standard, and deviations from that time frame are often sort of considered as problematic. I mean, I know that at master's level at Oxford, you can go part time, and at other universities, there's greater flexibility around how you interact with your tutors in terms of things like whether you take a sandwich course or whether you manage your time a little bit more in keeping with your needs. I think in Oxford it's relatively constrained, and it's constrained for a good reason. Speaking as an academic, we have short term so that we have chances to write books and do research and whatnot. But it does, on occasions, to me and certain to my students, feel like 3 8-week terms on the trot is pretty grueling, and it's not necessarily the best setup for everyone. I'm not sure it's the best setup for anyone, particularly, but um, as you say, there's a bit of a tradition that people feel they ought to uphold about this sort of quote unquote elite education and not letting standards slip. But I think we ought to have a bit more of a conversation about some of those aspects. I know how and why there would be pushback on some of this stuff, and I don't think that the people pushing back would have malicious motives, by the way. But it's just, I suppose, clear that the structures of the terms and the way we time things are not always very accommodating.
Yeah, I find that especially true at postgrad. Maybe I think this is more of a sector issue than an Oxford one. But as someone with ADHD, when you have very far off non-specific deadlines in the future, because everything was at the end of my 2-year course, that ended up kind of front loading everything and being backloading everything to the end and just being quite tricky. So, yeah, I think the other thing that I kind of think about is, so I was telling you before this, I ended up missing a few marks on one of my papers at the end of my master's. I'm having to resit. Technically, for all intents and purposes, I quote unquote failed my master's. Like, I'll still be graduating this summer, but I think that one thing that we haven't seen a lot of, especially in Oxford, maybe because it's quite statistically rare, is that failure. And I think it's not
Mm.
really something, because it's not normalized. People, staff and students, don't necessarily know what to do when it happens. They'll give you the empirical options, but for
Mm.
example, I didn't necessarily get many well-being offerings, right? So
Right.
I think maybe Oxford just needs to get over its pride a little bit in a good way, while still kind of upholding its traditions and stuff like that. But it's a hard debate.
It is hard, yeah, because you know, we do want to maintain standards, but that's such a nebulous phrase, right? I mean, we want to make sure that people get the best possible education, but that, of course, means that the best we get the best out of them, right? Rather than we force them into a mold that is somehow empirically and objectively the best, if you know what I mean. So there's a bit of a subjective component to what it means to have an excellent education. It can't just be fully objective, if that's clear. So it there should perhaps be a bit more of a dialogue sometimes, but I can fully understand why the university wouldn't necessarily want to do that for
Yeah, no.
25,000 people. Having a sort of tailored experience for everyone would be magnificently complicated.
Oxford is
Um,
absolutely massive. I think because it's such a hard university to get into, people forget that sometimes because it's such a statistically small amount.
mm.
But yeah. So obviously we've spoken a little bit about that from an access and outreach perspective, but as a whole, how do you think we can improve the higher education system to be more accommodating as both like individuals and a society?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I like to think that the higher education sector is getting a lot better. There seems to be, certainly compared to even when I started, which I started in higher education about 25 years ago. So even in that relatively short time frame, the consciousness that people present with a variety of different abilities and disabilities and learning differences, or whatever you want to call it, has shot up. And the signposting to resources and the making people aware of help being available is vastly better. And when I was at Bristol as an undergraduate, there was good signposting around very severe mental health crises. So in other words, they were worried we were going to kill ourselves, to be blunt. And so there was very good sort of awareness around that infrastructure. But beyond that, if you needed help, it was there, but you kind of had to really seek it out. It wasn't just its existence wasn't made particularly aware for you. And I think also digital services have helped. When I was an undergraduate, almost nothing was done online. So nowadays, you can get access to information far more quickly and easily. But I don't think we're there yet necessarily. I think there's still lots of people who really struggle through school and through university. And as I was saying earlier, if we try and think of the best education as getting the best out of a student, then I think there are ways we could be even more accommodating. But as mentioned earlier, I just think it's difficult to generalize about that because what that looks like will be so different for so many people. I think it's quite good that the Disability Advisory Service at Oxford and similar institutions at other universities are making support plans. They are trying to tailor things for individual students. It's not perfect because it's so complicated and resources are tight, but I think going down that path of being sensitive and aware of individuals and their needs is good. But yeah, I think we can still make progress. Sorry, that was not
No,
particularly coherent
that was a
answer,
good
but hopefully
answer. I
that's
liked it.
helped.
And that brings us to our final question of the show. So obviously we have kind of been here, there, and everywhere today. Because normally I interview people who have just graduated and just finished, and obviously you've had a career spanning much longer than an undergraduate or a master's degree. But if we were to take your
Right.
story, what would be one key takeaway that you would want listeners to remember?
Ooh. Okay. I think I don't know whether this was the culture or whether this was my personality, but for a long time I was just ashamed of my eyesight problem. I just thought it was a defect, and I would try and hide it. But then, eventually it was so obvious that I couldn't do certain things that it was incredibly embarrassing, and people just thought there was something wrong with me, and I thought there was something wrong with me. And that badly affected my approach to education because I was constantly sort of hiding and not raising my voice and trying not to get people's attention. And I don't quite know what clicked, but I think at some point, I think it was probably at Oxford, I just sort of realized this this sort of sense of self-deprecation is not working for me. If I want to get the best education possible, this is not the way to do it, because there is demonstrably help out there. There are empathetic and kind people who will be understanding. And I'm projecting onto the world this hostility that doesn't really exist. And it was just doing me harm. And so I suppose the one takeaway I would hope people learn is that, and I don't know if this is even a universal experience or whether this is just me, but if you're ever sort of tempted to think, I'm the problem, it's me, in a sort of Taylor Swift fashion, that you're not the problem, and there are ways that people can and will very happily help. And I think that was the relief I experienced when I did sort of say, actually, I find this really hard, and people didn't scorn me and say, well, that's because you're, a defective individual. That was just, it was an enormous relief, and then I could actually start doing things much more proactively and learn more and learn quicker and get better. So it was all good
Yeah,
news after that.
that's really good. I think it's a lot of aggressive self-acceptance, like I guess is the term for that. But yeah, that's really good. Thank you. Final thing, with Jesus College obviously started a new podcast with Access and Outreach. So do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, thanks. So we've only recently launched. It's called the What, Why, When podcast, and it's me talking to students of Jesus College and basically recreating an Oxford tutorial, which is a very small teaching moment. And we just throw around some interesting questions. I basically play the role of the annoying person asking difficult questions, and the students come up with these fantastic answers. And we discuss things from why Superman wears pants over leggings, to the science of stress, to where words came from and who invented them. So, a variety of quite cool topics. The idea is to just introduce people to how these sorts of Oxford tutorial conversations work, and also just to be interesting and fun, I hope.
And that's available on the Jesus College Oxford YouTube channel, right?
It is if you want to watch them, but you can also just get them wherever you listen to podcasts.
Amazing. Well, Matt, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Yeah, have a good one. Thank you so much. Cheers.
Thank you.